So here is our presentation of the Brexit. We've had the introduction. This is available, of course, on my website, reesonomics.eu, under the lessons for European economics. This is lesson 13 on the Brexit. And here we have a great photo before the referendum in the UK of London Pride, a good British bitter, and you can either have your beer served from the inn, staying in Europe, or from the getting out of Europe. Here we can see the referendum results, where the colour orange shows a majority to remain, blue to leave, and we can see quite clearly that Scotland, and the majority of Scots, wanted to remain. They had had a referendum previously on Scottish independence, which was that they voted against independence, but not by a great deal. We can see in Northern Ireland to the left that those to the south of Northern Ireland, if you follow me, mostly want to remain, and those in the north of Northern Ireland mostly to leave. In Wales we then have the Celtic coast, so the coastal parts of Wales want to remain. The more English parts of Wales want to leave. And we have a final result of just under 52% of the British people voting to leave. Now, we have to ask why do those who want to stay, why do they want to stay? Well, we've got, first of all, we have money coming in from the European Union, which goes to the poorest areas of Europe. So since Scotland and Wales are poorer than much of England, they're more likely to get regional funds, also called structural funds, subsidised by the European Union. In Ireland, of course, those living near the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland might have memories of the war that they had, and they would not want to have the problem of having a barrier between Ireland, which is in the European Union, and Northern Ireland, which would be outside the European Union. And most of the English voting to leave, which I discussed in my introduction, some of the reasons for them wanting to leave. I didn't mention also in Wales, of course, that there is Airbus in Wales. We make the wings for several of the Airbuses, especially the A320, which with the direct employment of about 20,000, and with the subsidiary suppliers, we're talking about 100,000 jobs in Wales, which we could lose if we lose Airbus. So here we can see the contributions to the budget. So in red you have the receipts, though this would mostly be from regional funds. It would also be for the Common Agricultural Policy. And in blue you have the contributions. The contributions represent 1% of the British budget, GDP. And we can see in green the rebate. This was the rebate negotiated by Margaret Thatcher, which annoyed many of the other European partners, because it was normal that the solidarity model, that the richest pay more in than they get back. So we can see the net contributions that in fact it costs in 2013, for example, that there's a total outgoing of £8.6 billion. Some of the data can be confusing. You might find different graphs, and especially on the Common Agricultural Policy, you can go to the EU Commission figures. So basically the British understood that they were paying more in than they were getting back, and that if they left the EU, then they would be able to save this money. But perhaps they forgot that the European Union runs on a 7-year budget, and once you've agreed to that budget, it can't be changed. So even if the UK leaves, it still has to contribute to the remaining commitments during that 7-year budget, which amounts to between 40 and 60 billion euros. So that's a big divorce bill when the British thought they were going to be making money, and they suddenly realized instead of saving nearly 9 billion, they're going to have to pay out 40 to 60 billion. One of the main arguing points concerning the referendum on leaving the European Union was about immigration. As I mentioned before, in 2004, when there was the big expansion of the European Union, the UK allowed basically all immigrants to move in with a free movement of labour. They didn't do what some other countries did, which was to use their 2 years to block them. And we can see an enormous jump of immigrants coming in from 2004. So this has an effect, of course, on salaries. So you can see in the bottom graph, you can see in red the weekly earnings, your wages, and you can see in blue your hourly wage. And you can see that quite clearly as immigration climbs, that from 2008, that wages start to fall. So you don't need to be a racist in order to be against immigration. If you're running a big company, you want to keep salaries low, if it's a factory, for example, with basic skills. So therefore, having a pool of unemployed labor is good because it means you can suppress labor demands for higher wages. So it was fairly clear that the people of Britain, one of their discontents was not the fact that immigration was happening, but that immigration was affecting their livelihoods. So what are the options? What were the possibilities for the UK if it left the European Union with the Brexit? First of all, we have a customized relationship with the EU. So once they've put into place the Brexit, Article 52 of the TEU, you then get 2 years to leave. In fact, the European Commission gave them much more than 2 years, as negotiations were complicated and the British weren't particularly prepared. And the idea was that the EU could basically pick and choose favoured or unfavoured policies. So, for example, the British would want to maintain free trade, to stay in the single market, but would refuse the immigration, the free movement of EU workers. So the EU Commission would obviously oppose this approach. And it would be the thin end of the wedge, and it would be a model for the others. Of course, for the European Commission, they were worried that if a Brexit was made too favourable for the UK, this could favour other countries wanting to leave as well. However, if they made it too difficult, they would lose a very valuable trading partner. So a second alternative is belonging to the EEA, the European Economic Area, like Iceland and Norway. These were mostly ex-EFTA countries, the European Free Trade Area, and they are part of the single market, but they don't belong to the European Union. So in blue you have the the members of all EU members belong to the EEA, so they're the EU members. And in green, you then have the other countries that are part of the single market. The problem with this is you have to pay. So, for example, Norway pays to have access to the single market, but is obviously outside all the decision making, whereby the agreement on the types of goods and how goods are made and so on, they're not involved in those negotiations at all. The problem for the British with this is that you have to allow the movement of labour. So if the UK join the EEA, they have to join EFTA, which is technically quite easy. They have to pay, it's not far off what they were paying for EU membership. So for those people who thought that they were going to save money by not joining the EU, that's a problem. You then have no real UK sovereignty. You have access to the single market, but you don't have to accept other policies. So, for example, this is why Norway doesn't want to join the EU, because it can protect its own fishing waters. So the UK would be able to protect its own fishing areas and wouldn't be part of the common agriculture policy, but it would have to accept all single market laws. And it has to accept the free movement of EU citizens, which was one of their main problems in the first place. And that EU EEA membership would have to be approved by all the other countries. Another possibility would be to join EFTA, but not the EEA. For example, Switzerland is in EFTA, but not in the EEA. It has bilateral agreements with the EU. EFTA covers trade for fish and some agriculture and no services. The UK would be excluded from EU external free trade agreements. So at the moment, British trade, over half of which is outside the single market, that trade is run via EU trade agreements. So whether it's in EFTA or not, this is still a problem for the British. We then have what we call the Swiss model. It took years to negotiate these agreements with the Switzerland. Services are not included. The Switzerland does not want to apply EU banking regulations, even though they're not very strict regulations, but so that they can maintain their banking sector. The EU is unhappy with the Swiss agreement. It would be very difficult for the UK and not very beneficial. I cannot see the European Commission ever agreeing a sort of Swiss model for the British. They'd be quite happy to get rid of the Swiss model altogether. For example, Switzerland strangely is a member of Schengen, but has all sorts of restrictions of goods going into Switzerland. So I don't quite see how that works. So then, why not have a UK-EU free trade agreement? Here we can see over the years, starting from 1999 up to 2019, we can see in blue that the trade which is outside the European Union, and in red the trade within the European Union. So you can see quite clearly that British trade, exports of goods and services, has increased outside the EU. And here we can see the UK trade balance with EU and non-EU countries. So the EU trade balance in blue, where basically we are in a negative trade balance. We import more than we export, and in red our non-EU balance. So we export more than we import from non-EU countries. So the economic arguments for if you wanted to leave the EU, you could say, okay, we don't need the EU because we've actually got a negative trade balance with them. But why? Because we want to import goods from the EU. At the moment, of course, that trade is free. So if you leave the EU, you leave free trade, and then there would be tariff barriers of British goods exported to the EU, and it would then depend on whether the British wanted to have tariff barriers against the EU and which products it would do that with. So some sort of agreement is what we're going to end up with anyway, I guess. But this takes a long time. The UK government needs negotiators. Who does the negotiating for the European Union is the European Commission. All the specialists are in Brussels and not in London. But again, the UK would still be bound by EU single market regulations on health and safety, competition policy, product standards, consumer protection, technical specifications, etc. And the other thing is that we saw the UK trade with countries external to the EU. Much of that trade is in services. London is the banking or the financial sector for Europe. It's one of the biggest centres for financial services in the world, and it opposes strongly the idea of having a financial transactions tax or a financial transfers tax, the FTT. Some European countries would like to tax speculation and trading. The British are obviously against it. So the other problem for London is, could they hold on to the power of London for financial services if the UK is outside the European Union? And many big banks have already moved their offices, moving out from London into to Paris, to other countries, in Italy, Germany. A customs union is another possibility. This is like the relationship that we have with Turkey, and this has several advantages. If you remember, a customs union means that you have free trade of agreed goods with the EU. So, for example, Turkey has free trade with the EU, but it excludes agriculture because of problems with the common agricultural policy. But you have to have the same external customs duties. So, for example, if the EU has an import tariff of 10 cents a litre on ethanol, then Turkey has to apply the same tariff. This is, for example, in terms of importing cars, 10% import tariff into the EU. If cars were imported into Turkey from the USA with no import duty and then transferred with no import duty into the EU, this would undercut this would avoid paying that import duty into the EU. So that's a customs union. So the UK would not, in this case, be free to set any different tariffs, so it would have to apply EU trade tariffs, which would mean it would have no trade sovereignty. So the UK would have no intervention in EU trade negotiations. So, for example, relations with South Korea. South Korea has automatic access to the Turkish market, but Turkey has no access to the South Korean market. So it's a possibility and has been discussed by many politicians as a possibility, but again, doesn't give the independence that the British are looking for, but it does mean they don't have to allow immigration into the UK. If no agreements are made, you then come down to the world agreement by the World Trade Organization, which sets limits on maximum tariffs. If you remember, the WTO was born from the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was part of the Bretton Woods negotiations. The idea being that the Americans wanted to limit barriers to their goods they wanted to export. So with the WTO rules, which would basically be if no negotiations, other negotiations succeed, the UK would have to establish customs control, including with Ireland. UK goods would face EU import tariffs. For example, a lot of cars are exported from the UK into Europe, and cars and car engines are a 10% import tariff. Is this a problem? Well, you might think adding 10% to the cost of a car is prohibitive, but in that the UK isn't in the Eurozone, all it needs to offset an import tariff of 10% is to devalue the pound by 10%. So I don't think that's particularly a problem. The UK would be excluded from European free trade agreements with about 60 non-EU countries. So in any case, the UK has to go through this. It's going to have to renegotiate with all the countries that it trades with. They've lost the negotiation skills and people. After the referendum, the government desperately tried to find 400 experts in international trade. So that's going to be difficult and expensive, and a trade agreement takes 10, sometimes 20 years to actually negotiate. And the UK has much less bargaining power than the EU. If you're organizing or negotiating a trade agreement and you represent the European Union, you have an enormous amount of market power that you don't have if you're only the United Kingdom. So it's been a long and slow struggle. So the 2019, the UK Parliament votes no for 8 options. That the EU leaves the EU on April 12th without a deal, that was defeated. That we have a Norway-style deal, that's the EEA, which would include membership of the EU single market, as well as a customs arrangement with the EU, that was defeated as well. That we remain a member of the EEA and reapply to join the EFTA, that was defeated as well. That a Brexit deal must include as a minimum a commitment to negotiate a permanent and comprehensive UK-wide customs union with the EU, that was defeated narrowly. Opposition Labour Party plan for a close economic relation with the EU included a comprehensive customs union, supported by Corbyn, and close alignment with the single market, that was defeated. Revocation to avoid a no deal, in other words, if no negotiations is successful with the EU, then in that case that the Brexit would be cancelled, that was defeated. Confirming the referendum to approve a Brexit deal before it is ratified by Parliament, in other words, to have a second referendum, that was also defeated. And contingent preferential arrangements, a managed no-deal process in the event an exit agreement with the EU is not reached, is defeated. So everything was defeated. The other problems that have to be resolved, the British that live or work in the European Union, there's about 2 million people who were not allowed to vote in the referendum, much to their ire. They would become non-EU citizens. So what would their status be? What would their access be to social security systems and health? EU citizens living in the UK would also change status, and The problem would be, what would be the status now of French, for example, working in Britain? There are a lot. The UK students would be deprived of Erasmus, university exchanges. The UK might be excluded from European research agreements. Defence agreements might change. Defence is a very tricky subject as well, since the UK has one of the largest, most sophisticated defence forces. They would no longer be in the European defence system. And external policing systems or agreements that exist at the moment might change. But maybe I hoped that the Brexit would wake up the European Commission, the European Council and the European Parliament that there are serious problems in the EU. When I made this PowerPoint, the EU had an 11% unemployment. That's not true now, but it's not viable. And we've seen across Europe that a lot of people feel that the European Union is not looking after them. We've seen hence the rise in nationalist parties and anti-European feelings across Europe. So was the Brexit a wake-up call? It doesn't seem so. I haven't seen much reaction. We now have the COVID-19 crisis. How is the European Union going to react to that? I do feel that there is a lot of justified criticism about the functioning of the European Union and the Eurozone, and that the European Union as such might not survive unless it wakes up and changes direction. So finally, what will be the situation of Great Britain if Scotland quits Great Britain to remain in the EU? Well, at the moment, the opinion polls show that the Scottish would vote for independence, but they've not been allowed to hold a referendum by the British government in London. What about the situation of Ireland and Northern Ireland? The European Commissioner said there is no way there's going to be a border, so that border would actually be between Great Britain and Ireland. Quite how that is going to work is not very clear. Maybe, perhaps, one of the best things that could happen would be that Northern Ireland joins Ireland and remains part of the European Union as part of Ireland. Would Wales then follow with a referendum and leave England all on its own? Well, we will see what happens. That's the end of your presentation, and the rest of the lesson is you can follow in your guidelines.